Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ORF for this special talk by Dr. Pradeep Taneja on a topic which I think most of us who are here constantly ponder about in some way, shape, or form. And we are also looking at China today in a very interesting context where they've just celebrated their 70th year of establishing themselves as a communist state. And a lot of the discussion on China has also mutated over the last few years in some very interesting directions. Pradeep has been writing about and thinking about China now for ages. He has he is with the University of Melbourne, though presently he's working on a project on Indian Ocean and Sino-Indian competition. I don't think that's the primary focus, that's going to be the primary focus of his discussion, but of course it can come up later on in our question and answer session. But I think largely the discussion today is about a topic which has taken some very interesting turn. If you are looking at the Western discourse of China today, and if you compare the discourse, say, even 5 years back, you would find a remarkable trajectory evolving in directions that I think few envisioned just a few years back. The collapse of that consensus on China, and this is also true, by the way, in academia, and the sort of this at the interstate level, and the fraying of ties between the West and China being manifested in various ways today, is a significant theme of international relations today and is shaping IR not only in very significant ways but also Indian foreign policy. And as Chinese president prepares his visit to India this month, I think this is an important topic to think about for India, but also the larger trajectory of global politics, how it is evolving, and what role China can potentially play, both as a disruptor as well as a country that at one point was seen to be a guarantor of the global liberal order that the West had created. So with that, let me give the floor to Pradeep, who will dwell on this topic more, and perhaps also if Pradeep, you can talk about the Australian discussion on this topic, which is evolving in some very interesting ways. We have had one of the most public debates on China in Australia in recent years, which is quite intriguing and at the same time fascinating sitting here in New Delhi. So Pradeep, floor is yours.
Thank you, Hirsch. It's good to be back at ORF at a time when we've just seen China celebrate the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. There are a few more landmarks coming up in the next few years. So clearly we'll all be watching, how China marks those occasions and whether all those targets which have been set for the landmarks in 2021, then again, of course, in 2049. My interest in this subject really is largely because of the debates that have been going on in Australia. In Australia, those of you who've been recently to Australia would have noticed that in the Australian media, not a day goes by when we don't have stories or controversies to do with China. And therefore, the great deal of intellectual energies go into debating China's activities in Australia and also generally more broadly China's ambitions and China's sort of goals and objectives. So when you live in Australia, and then you teach about China and you research on China, it is inevitable that you cannot avoid talking about this issue. But I want to go back 40 years and look at the beginning of China's economic reform. When China began its economic reform, of course, China's per capita GDP was roughly about the same as India's. And therefore, nobody expected China to become a cause for concern or cause for fear, and certainly not in Western capitals. Australia, of all the Western capitals, Canberra, wasn't particularly concerned because Canberra had established diplomatic relations with China in 1972, and Australia was already exporting, valuable commodities to China. And as China's economic growth picked up, China's appetite for Australian commodities continues to rise. So Australia continued to shovel up and sell iron ore and other commodities to China. And in fact, when I first arrived in Australia from China in the mid-1980s, Australian Labor government, Prime Minister Bob Hawke and his Treasurer Paul Keating were very optimistic about China's future. And there was generally an expectation amongst China's Western partners that China will become like the West, that if China continues to open up, if China continues to trade with us, if China continues to liberalize its institutions, its universities, overall, China will eventually become more or less like us. Not exactly a multi-party democracy necessarily, but there would be a degree of convergence between the Chinese system and the Western liberal democracies. But then most of the optimists who were hopeful of this convergence suffered a bit of a setback in their positive view of China when the Chinese leadership decided on the 3rd of June 1989 to deal with the ongoing student protests in the way they did. And you can go to YouTube and watch the video of Prime Minister Bob Hawke of Australia speaking in the Australian Parliament with tears rolling down his cheeks, talking about the crushing of the movement in 1989. And that particular episode, of course, led to, at least momentarily, this belief that China was going to turn inwards, that the decision to use military force to crack down on a largely peaceful student demonstration, student protest, even though it had been going for nearly 2 months, was an indication that China perhaps was going to turn inwards, become more insular, and stop the reforms which had been going on since Deng Xiaoping first decided to introduce those reforms in the late 1970s. But then again, Deng Xiaoping decided that no, China will continue to open its economy. So even though politically he would not brook any demands for democratic change, but economically he decided China will continue to open up its economy. And in fact, Deng Xiaoping's decision was such that even many senior leaders of the Communist Party, and certainly provincial leaders, did not believe his words. And that's why he had to go in 1992 on the so-called Southern Tour to Shenzhen, jump on a train and go to South China to try and persuade those people that he meant what he said, that we'll continue to open up the economy. Go ahead, trade with the countries you want to trade with. Go ahead and open up your economies, provincial economies, cities, and continue to engage with the outside world. So once that decision had been made, and it became clear that China will continue to open up at least its economy, there was once again hope that China will, pluralize, China will liberalize. And when, even before 1989, China, of course, had applied to become a member of GATT in 1986. And of course, by 1989, not much progress had been made. But once Deng Xiaoping decided to open up the economy, we saw China gradually continue to make their progress. Ultimately, of course, China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. But in the lead up to China's application, or the processing of China's application for the GATT membership, leaders in many Western countries, in Australia, and certainly Bill Clinton in particular, were quite optimistic that if China continues to open its economy, ultimately we will see change on all fronts. And of course, this was the same Bill Clinton who had described the leaders of China after Tiananmen Square as the butchers of Beijing when he was campaigning for elections. But once he became president, then there were signs that engagement was perhaps the better strategy. And I quote here from a speech that Bill Clinton gave in 2000 on China. He said, "For 30 years, every president of both persuasions, Democrat or Republican, has worked for a China that contributes to the stability of Asia, that is open to the world, that upholds the rule of law at home and abroad. So this was, of course, Bill Clinton making a case that we do need to accept China as a member of the World Trade Organization. And of course, we try and get as many concessions as we can from China. But in the end, giving China a membership in GATT or the WTO would be in America's interest and in the interest of the Western world. Clinton also said the more China liberalizes its economy, the more fully it will liberate the potential of its people. So by potential, of course, he wasn't simply talking about the ability to make money, but also the freedom to think differently, the freedom to innovate, and to the freedom to be creative. And he said, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products, it is agreeing to import one of democracy's more cherished values, economic freedom. And the subtext of this, of course, is that economic freedom would bring with it political freedom. It would bring at least, a semblance of political plurality. And that was, of course, then. And as we are now discovering, as Hirsch pointed out, certainly in Washington now, there seems to be a consensus that approach, Clintonian approach, has failed, that it hasn't worked. Although China has become the world's second largest economy, but China has not moved in the direction that people like Bill Clinton or Australia's Prime Minister Bob Hawke were indicating. So what really was expected by people like Bill Clinton and others who thought that engagement would be a better strategy was some sort of convergence in systems, convergence in institutions, and particularly as China became a member of most of the international institutions, there was a belief that this convergence would become a reality. It doesn't mean that the Chinese system would become exactly like the Western systems or copy lock, stock, and barrel the same institutions, but there was a belief that there will be a convergence in the two systems. So what do we have instead? I mean, if you don't have convergence, what do we have in China? I personally, my sort of belief is that what we have in China is a mixture of state capitalism and corporatism. A Leninist sort of state capitalism, but also corporatism. It is true that China has produced a large number of very wealthy people. Many Chinese entrepreneurs have become very successful, accumulated considerable amount of wealth. China has a very large number, if not the largest number, of billionaires, and some of these people have established companies which have been quite successful. But what is their relationship with the Chinese state? And here I'm referring to the corporatist nature. So the state capitalism certainly is an important part of the mix, because you still have most of the traditional sectors of China's economy still dominated by the state-owned companies. So whether it's civil aviation, whether it's banking, whether it's insurance, whether it's transportation, or heavy industry, you still find that those sectors are still dominated by state-owned companies. It's a different matter that many of them are not as efficient as their private counterparts, but certainly the state-owned enterprises do play a very important part in certain traditional sectors of the Chinese economy. But what of the private enterprise, the private entrepreneurs? The private entrepreneurs, people like Jack Ma, and a number of other companies which have come up and which have become a large international conglomerate, particularly using new technologies. What is their role and what's their relationship with the Chinese state? Certainly, in the opinions of people like Bill Clinton, I think, going back to 2000, there was an expectation that a wealthy class in China, and certainly a large middle class in China, will become self-interested, so much so that they would demand political change. And of course, the arguments were similar to what happened in other parts of East Asia, but also, if we go back a little bit further, what happened in Europe. The new middle class, which was denied political rights, and then it grows to become a powerful force, and therefore demands democratic change. So there was an expectation that China too will have this so-called new middle class, and this new middle class will become a force for political change in China. But that certainly hasn't happened. That hasn't happened largely because this new wealthy class has been co-opted into the system. And that process began almost at the same time as China joined the World Trade Organization. Because until then, the private entrepreneurs were seen with suspicion. They were seen with suspicion because it was felt that if we leave them out, and at that time there was no mechanism for bringing them in, if we leave them out, they'll become a problem. And at the same time, if we try and suppress them, then it affects our economic agenda. In other words, if you suppress the growth of private enterprises, then it would affect the economy, and it would affect the living standards, and therefore the main source of legitimacy for the Communist Party, the rise in the economic welfare of the people, would be undermined. So what do you do? And of course, the person who ultimately, embraced the capitalists in China was Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin came up with this theory of three represents, or the theory of three represents, of course, indicated that private entrepreneurs were not the enemy of the people. They, in fact, were part of the productive forces, that their contribution to China's economy, Chinese society was significant, and it needs to be acknowledged. And thus, the changes made to the Chinese, particularly the Communist Party constitution in 2001, paved the way for co-optation of China's private elite. But it wasn't a simple matter of co-optation that, we accept who you are, and you can be a communist and a billionaire at the same time. But you had to make certain compromises. In return for the party giving you the freedom to continue to make money and enjoy the luxuries of life that come with accumulation of wealth, you still have to make certain compromises. And of course, private enterprises were required to have Communist Party branches. So any enterprise which had more than 8 Chinese Communist Party members was required to have a Communist Party branch. But not only a branch, you also had to have, if you have a branch, of course, you also had to have the same ideological training that goes in state-owned enterprise. Just to give you one anecdote, I had a friend in Melbourne from China who was working in Melbourne. He went back to China and became an employee of Alibaba, Jack Ma's company, which has a number of subsidiaries. And he told me that he was working for Jack Ma Foundation. Jack Ma has his foundation which does charity work and donates money even to universities in Australia, and that he was working with the foundation. And a few months later he told me that no, he was now working with the board of Alibaba. In other words, he had a promotion and he was working with the board, but he wouldn't tell me exactly what his role was. And last year when I was in China, I was sitting next to a young man who said that he also works for Alibaba. And I said, I have a very good friend who works for Alibaba and apparently works with the board. And he said he hadn't heard of him, but he said, okay, let me look up. And he looked up the phone directory of the company, the internal phone directory of the company. And he said, oh yes, I found him. He works for the Theory Bureau. I said, what's a theory bureau in a private company? Alibaba is supposed to be a private company. Even if it has a Communist Party branch, what's a theory bureau? And obviously, it doesn't appear anywhere in Alibaba's publicity, but companies like Alibaba and many other private companies have to have the organizational units within the company who focus on the ideological work of the party. So reading Chairman Xi Jinping's works would be an important part of the task of the senior executives of a company like Alibaba too. So the deal is basically that as you see in any corporatist system, that private entrepreneurs are allowed to make money, allowed to do business, but at the same time they have to work very closely with the state. And they have to demonstrate a solid understanding of the state's ideology and state policies. And any step out of line can get you into trouble. And we know entrepreneurs who actually have fallen foul of the system. There's one of them sitting in New York who continues to make videos and post them on YouTube, but he certainly is somebody who is never coming back to China, or if he does, he wouldn't be a free man. So clearly the corporatist arrangements work very well, as you would expect in any corporatist system, because while the state-owned enterprises continue to exist and continue to play an important part in certain key sectors, the party leadership knows that the bulk of the jobs are created by private enterprises. The bulk of the taxes are contributed by private enterprises. So the key was to get these private enterprises to work with the state, to understand the state's agenda and the party's agenda, and then conform to that agenda. If you do that, then you can continue to make money, and you will be considered as a progressive, productive force in Chinese society. So what we've seen is a mixture of state capitalism and corporatism. I teach a postgraduate course at Melbourne University called Politics and Business in Postmodern China, where we look at this relationship in a lot more detail, the relationship between the party and the state. And just going through case studies, you can see, company after company is deeply involved in promoting the state's agenda. So what we have, instead of convergence between the two systems, broadly speaking, the Western liberal democracy and the Chinese system, the Chinese state capitalist or the corporatist system, is what I've called systemic incompatibility, an increasing systemic incompatibility. The two systems are becoming, or in many ways have already become, incompatible with each other. And that is manifested in the disputes that's going on currently between the United States and China on trade, but of course the trade disputes go much deeper than simply trade. It's not so much about tariffs, it is much deeper, and it's perhaps a manifestation of that growing systemic incompatibility. If it was only a trade dispute, then it'll be a dispute between the Trump administration and the Chinese government. But it seems that on both sides of the political aisle in Washington, there is a belief that something needs to be done. There is this consensus that something needs to be done about China, although I think there's no consensus on what needs to be done. But certainly there seems to be consensus that something needs to be done. So with these, the differences in systems and institutions, the goals and objectives of Western governments and China are also becoming divergent. So what we are seeing is a divergence of objectives. Now, if you read the speeches of Chinese leaders, if you read the People's Daily, of course, China will never seek hegemony. China will, always pursue peaceful win-win solutions. But increasingly, that view is not being accepted at face value in many foreign capitals. There is a growing sort of dichotomy between what the Chinese government says and what it does. So what has led to this situation? I mean, how did we get here? How did we get to the situation where euphoria about China's economic rise, particularly in countries like Australia, the demand for Australian commodities, and the fact that the Australian government repeatedly tells us that we've had 28 years of continuous growth. Australia hasn't had a negative quarter. And largely, in fact, the Chinese ambassador to Canberra just a few days ago at the reception to, or in an interview he gave to mark the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic, reminded Australians that that your economic prosperity is dependent on our miracle. So our miracle has really made you prosperous. Of course, he forgot to mention that China buys Australian commodities not because China likes Australia, but because Australia is an efficient supplier of those commodities. So I'm not sure whether the Chinese government could change that. In fact, over the last 12 months or so, Australia-China relationship has been in a bit of a freezer. No Australian Prime Minister has visited China since April 2016. I mean, a bilateral visit. There was a visit by the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull in September 2016, but that was for a multilateral, I think for G20 meeting. But no bilateral invitation has been extended to an Australian Prime Minister for more than 3 years now. And even ministers have found it difficult to get an invitation to visit China, although ministers have been visiting China. So there is certainly, a cooling down of the relationship, political relationship between the Australian government and the Chinese government, but it has not affected trade. In fact, the trade, Chinese imports of Australian commodities have continued to rise. So if China was punishing Australia, it's certainly punishing the Prime Minister of Australia by not inviting him, but it still continues to import Australian commodities as Chinese companies have continued to produce steel and other commodities because they have continued to stimulate the economy. So the stimulus that the Chinese given has been injecting into the Chinese economy has continued to grow demand for Australian commodities. So, as I said, we need to ask what happened, what has led to this situation. And I'll give you 3 points here. First of all, the accumulation of unprecedented resources at the disposal of the Chinese Communist Party state. I think the financial resources that the Chinese Communist Party commands today are unprecedented. I mean, the fact that this state capitalist and corporatist model of economic development has put so much financial wealth at the disposal of the Chinese state that it has led to a confidence in the party leadership, a sense of confidence that that our system works and there is no need to change the system. So any degree of self-doubt that was there, that seems to have evaporated with the accumulation of financial wealth. And that's, that wealth has allowed the party state to undertake activities which are now being, talked about in Western capitals, from Berlin to Canberra. You hear about, Chinese influence, and I'll come back to that in a second. So the accumulation of financial resources through this economic model has been a significant factor in the reasons why Chinese leadership has become so confident about their system. A second factor is what I would argue is a failure of Chinese soft power. There was a belief that if China continues to engage with the rest of the world, and if China, proactively seeks to promote its soft power, then everything will be fine. In other words, China will go under the radar. China would be attractive to governments and people in other countries, and therefore, investment in soft power was something which was to be encouraged. And many of you would remember, if you visited China 10 or 12 years ago, there was a great deal of discussion in universities, international relations department about soft power. Joseph Nye himself was invited to China and gave a series of lectures a number of times in Chinese universities on soft power, and they were very keen to learn about soft power. And one of the first steps taken to promote this soft power was the creation of Confucius Institutes. And of course, a great deal of deliberation went into creating those institutes, because if China was going to follow the example of other countries, other larger powers who had created organizations which were responsible for promotion of their culture and values, then certainly Confucius Institute was seen to be the answer. The problem, of course, was that the Chinese Communist Party itself wasn't quite sure about Confucius. Having launched a campaign in the early 1970s against Confucius, lumping Lin Biao and Confucius together, the former defense minister Lin Biao, the party wasn't quite sure, whether the opening of Confucius Institute would also lead to the promotion of Confucius, or whether they should actually be engaged in promoting Confucian values. And we know in the 1980s in East Asia, there was considerable debate about Asian values. And that debate did not originate in China, although it did come to China later on, but it was more like Singapore and Malaysia who were championing Asian values, in other words, Confucian values. But when China began to open these Confucius Institutes around the world, they were not actually seeking to promote Confucianism. Confucius was simply a convenient name because, otherwise, what do you call it? Mao Zedong Institute? That will face resistance, right? Even Zhou Enlai Institute would have faced resistance. So what do? You call them Confucius because they gathered that Confucius is very well known. Everybody in the West have heard of Confucius, and therefore by calling these institutes, these centers, Confucius Institutes, there'll be some sort of brand recognition. People associate Confucius with China, and therefore Confucius Institutes will do things which will promote Chinese culture and enhance China's soft power. But as I said, the Communist Party itself wasn't quite sure about Confucius. Some of you might remember about 10 years ago, suddenly a big statue of Confucius appeared in Tiananmen Square, near the History Museum. And without any ceremony, without any announcement, a statue of Confucius, but a large statue of Confucius, appeared in the heart of Beijing. And those of us who watched China closely were wondering, who was actually behind this? But equally surprisingly, 3 months later, that statue disappeared. Again, without any discussion, without any announcement. And there was debate. And this was about the same time when Confucius Institutes were being opened in various foreign universities. And the reason why Confucius disappeared was because there was no consensus within the party. Even though the Chinese government, the Chinese Research Council had been funding research projects on Confucius and Confucianism, and philosophy and the historical role of Confucius, but at the same time, the party really has never fully, to use an unpopular phrase, rehabilitated Confucius. So having launched that campaign in the early 1970s, the party hasn't fully actually, accepted Confucian ideas. And plus, in addition to the divisions within the party on Confucius, you had a number of enthusiastic supporters of Confucius in China. You had a few intellectuals who were actually, encouraged by the creation of Confucius Institutes, they were putting forward ideas based on Confucian philosophy for a future political system of China. So a Chinese scholar called Jiang Qing, not the same characters as Mao's wife, widow, but Jiang Qing wrote a piece along with Daniel Bell, a Canadian scholar who works in China, in New York Times, articulating a tricameral parliament for China, where the most powerful chamber of Chinese parliament under this Confucian system would be a house of scholars who would be well versed in Confucian theory, Confucian philosophy, and they would constitute the most powerful chamber of parliament, and others being officials, and then the third one being a popularly elected, but the popularly elected one to be the least powerful of the three chambers of commerce. So the fact that these debates started taking place within Chinese intellectual circles, looking at Confucianism as providing solutions to an alternative ideology to the Communist Party's current ideology. Whether you believe that's Marxism or not is a different matter, but that was seen as a kind of substitute to this ideology. So the party has been skeptical of any debate about alternatives to the present system. including the the speeches and writings of scholars who were actually putting forward Confucian philosophy and Confucian ideas as a way to provide an alternative, thinking on Chinese political system. Third factor which has led to this confidence in the leadership is related to the fact that the party now feels that it has an economic and political model that works. And not only it works in China, since 2017, there is a belief that this can also work in other jurisdictions. So until 2017, the Communist Party Congress in 2017, where the party document actually said that other countries may learn something from China's experience. Until that time, Chinese officials and scholars used to say that, no, we are not promoting any China model. Even though Chinese scholars, some of the Chinese scholars had written books about the China model, but officials and official intellectuals were quite sort of careful not to argue that there was a China model which could work in other jurisdictions. They used to say that the Chinese experience is based on China's own conditions, and other countries will have different conditions, and therefore we are not advocating that what works in China will work in other countries, and therefore we don't have a model for it. But the 2017 reference to other countries being able to learn something from China was also in a way consistent with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative started in 2013, or at least was announced in 2013, and with that, with the kind of investment which was promised in the Belt and Road Initiative, I think there was, if you look at the writings of some of the Chinese scholars, you'll find that they also talk about not only building highways and roads and buildings, but also transferring Chinese ideas into other jurisdictions along the Belt and Road. So there is now a belief that the Chinese model is superior. It works not only in China, but it can also work in other countries, certainly in developing countries. One of the interesting things about China, as I'm sure many of you would be aware, is that China has multiple identities. Multiple identities where China can be a developing country 1 minute in the same meeting room in the foreign ministry. In another meeting with the United States, China wants a G2. So these multiple identities are quite convenient because it allows the Chinese leadership to develop a different narrative that suits the audience. And this idea that if you accept Chinese loans, if you accept Chinese assistance, in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, then there are other ideas we could also offer to you, and these ideas would go consistently. And there are in some countries now, in Africa, for example, you have a growing number of graduates of Chinese universities. In 1 or 2 countries, the graduates of Chinese universities have become presidents and prime minister now. So there is this belief that there would be a receptiveness to Chinese ideas on development, which are part of the China model. Okay, so when we talk about, as I said, the title of my talk is why does the West fear China? And the necessary question, of course, is what does the West fear? So if it fears China, what does the West fear in China's rising power? First, of course, it depends on your own kind of positioning within the international system. So if you look at the successive Pew surveys conducted in the US and in other parts of the world, you will find that Americans are less worried about China's hard power. I mean, there was a survey just done recently in which 60% of Americans and 67% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of China. But when you drill down, then you find that only about 26% of Americans are worried about China's military power. They're more worried about China's economic power. They're more worried about the debt that America owes to China, and therefore, the way the way China might be able to influence America. So American public seems to be more worried about China's economic power than about its military power, because American public has greater confidence in America's own military capabilities and a belief that China still has a long way to go to catch up with America. So there is much less concern about China's rising power in military terms in the United States than it is in countries like Australia. So there is much greater concern about China's growing military power. If you go back and look at Australia's defense white papers or foreign policy white paper, you will see that there are calls for Australia to double its military expenditure. As if Australia is going to be able to defend itself on its own. So, but there is a belief that Australia, to be valuable to the United States as an ally, Australia needs to increase its own defense spending, and hence, programs to acquire new submarines and to acquire F-35s. So China's growing hard power is a concern in many Western countries, but not necessarily in the United States. In Australia, for example, in 2000, and this goes back a long way before Trump, because in 2011, during President Obama's visit to Australia, Australian government agreed to host 2,500 US Marines in Darwin on a so-called rotational basis. Now, that's more than any time in the Cold War. And there was never any public sort of support for a large presence of American troops or Marines in Australia, but the 2011 agreement was, at least implicitly, obviously explicitly the Australian government would not say that it's about China, but implicitly it was about China. It was about China's rising power and China's growing assertiveness in the region. A second fear which manifests itself in a number of countries is China's cyber capabilities. We have seen, even in Australia, and I'll give you examples from Australia, where there is a significant concern about China's capabilities in this area. And these capabilities have been demonstrated by hacking into the computer systems of universities and other institutions. The Australian National University, for example, was the target of a major attack. And according to Australian intelligence analysts, the source of this attack was in China. Although the government has been careful not to directly blame China, but the university's own security analysts pointed towards China, that this, and it was a massive attack because it stole a lot of information, including credit card, bank account details of a large number of university employees. Now, but clearly the target wasn't the credit card details, because the targets are obviously about the intellectual capital that the good universities around the world accumulate. So the second fear is about China's sizable cyber capabilities and what they mean for liberal democracies. And third fear that people have is about the ability of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government to influence the domestic policies in democratic societies. Many of you would be aware of the United Front department of the Chinese Communist Party. The United Front department has existed long before the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949. But the research interest in the work of the United Front department has never been as great as it is now. My colleagues, people like Jerry Groot at the University of Adelaide, who have been working on the United Front department for years now, and nobody gave them any invitations to attend international conferences because nobody seemed to be interested in the work of the United Front. But suddenly, scholars who work on United Front are in demand because many governments are worried about the activities of the United Front and the way it operates. And the United Front by itself, of course, is a department of the Chinese Communist Party that was formed during the so-called War of Resistance against Japan, or the Second World War, and in the Chinese Civil War, to facilitate coordination between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. Because Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party, as many of you would be aware, were forced into forming alliances twice, not once. And the United Front was supposed to facilitate that work. And where Chinese Communist Party wanted to have the upper hand, and the United Front work was supposed to help with that. But increasingly, United Front is playing a very active role in international activities. And we have scholars like Clive Hamilton in Australia, who published a book a year ago called The Silent Invasion. Now, some people find that work a bit provocative, and it is in some ways, but at the same time, a lot of the evidence presented in works like Clive Hamilton's Silent Invasion refers to the work of United Front and the way the United Front operates in liberal democracies. So, for example, the Chinese countries that have liberal democracies that have Chinese diaspora, sizable Chinese diaspora. Australia's population of 24 million has about 1.2 million ethnic Chinese. Now, most ethnic Chinese, of course, are not particularly loyal to the Chinese Communist Party or enamored of its ideology. But there's also been recent migration from China, particularly in the last 15 years or so. And among them are very wealthy individuals. Many of these countries tend to have business visas, which are based on your ability to bring in money into the country and invest that money. So therefore, we have many of the Chinese wealthy entrepreneurs, and many of them are also members of the Chinese Communist Party and work very closely with the party. They have emigrated to Australia. And while they continue to run most of their businesses in China, but they also start new businesses in Australia. So just give you one anecdote. There was a case of a Chinese billionaire businessman called Huang Xiangmo. Huang Xiangmo is, of course, he made most of his money in China. He's a billionaire. He's into a range of business activities. In Australia, most of his business is focused on construction, development, property development. Now, the state of New South Wales in Australia, under the anti-corruption laws, has a law that developers are not allowed to donate to political parties because there seems to be a lot of corruption in property development, and therefore, the state has enacted laws which prevent property developers from donating money to political parties. And we recently had a case where Huang Xiangmo had been working very closely, wining and dining politicians, organizing fundraising events where people would make small donations. So $5,000 is acceptable, and you don't need a great deal of disclosure for up to $5,000 of donations to political parties. Huang Xiangmo was not just a businessman who was quietly carrying out his business and traveling between China and Australia. He was also the frontman for a United Front agency or organization created in Australia and a number of other countries, which was designed to promote the Chinese view of the South China Sea, to advance the Chinese cause in the South China Sea. And through his connections with the Australian political elite, he managed to organize meetings where even some of the Australian politicians also articulated Chinese position on the South China Sea. We had a case where a young senator from the Labour Party, which was in opposition, still is in opposition. This young senator, who was dynamic, he was born in Iran, he was the first Australian parliamentarian who was born in Iran, but very ambitious, very active, also working very closely with the Chinese community, because Chinese community has been a significant donor, but also the fact that there is a sizable Chinese community. All politicians of all hues try to work with the Chinese community, and there's nothing wrong with working with the Chinese community, clearly. But this particular senator hosted this event about the South China Sea in the Parliament House, with an Australian coat of arms in the background. And he literally read from Chinese government's position on South China Sea, saying that South China Sea is China's internal matter, and we should not really be interfering it or criticizing China. This was against his own party's policy. This was against the policy of the Labour Party. And therefore, he had to explain to his leader, and the government, of course, made a big issue in Parliament, and eventually this young senator's career came to an end when he was forced by the leader of his party to resign. Not only resign from the party, but resign from the Senate. So, and he is now acknowledged. I mean, he appeared on a television program just a few weeks ago, and he said, "I was stupid. You know, I should have asked more questions, but I saw this gentleman, you know, as a legitimate businessman and generous benefactor, you know, of political parties, and therefore, as an active fundraiser for the party, I got carried away. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it." But the Australian government then not only, you know, obviously welcomed the resignation of this young senator, but also informed the Chinese businessman who was now a permanent resident in Australia, who had an application pending for citizenship. And this young senator, in fact, had been lobbying the immigration department to have his citizenship application approved quickly. But then with the intelligence that the government received from the intelligence agencies, they informed this Chinese businessman when he was in Hong Kong that his permanent residency visa had been cancelled and he's no longer allowed to return to Australia. And that's probably the most high-profile example of the United Front work that's going on in liberal democracies, particularly where there is a sizable Chinese diasporic community. But as I said earlier, this is not meant to cast any aspersions of the Chinese community in Australia, because most members of the Chinese community in Australia are, you know, free, peaceful, you know, and democratic citizens of Australia who take active part in Australia's compulsory voting system. They go and queue up and vote at every election. But it has also meant that any candidate of Chinese origin who stands for office becomes the subject of doubt. We, for example, recently had, at the last election earlier this year, for the first time, an ethnic Chinese member of the lower house of Australia's parliament elected, from, in fact, my constituency, area where I live. And there were only the two candidates for the coalition government and the Labour Party in opposition were both Chinese. The Labour Party candidate was born in Taiwan, and the Liberal Party, or the coalition candidate, was born in Hong Kong. And they obviously actively campaigned in the election. They had a number of fundraising events, and apparently one of the fundraising events that this winning candidate, born in Hong Kong, organized, the Prime Minister was supposed to attend, and the Prime Minister was advised by the intelligence agencies to stay away from that fundraising dinner because the money being donated at this function could be tainted. In other words, this could be money which may not be coming from ordinary citizens. This may be, in fact, money which is being sort of plowed into the Australian campaign on behalf of the United Front department. Of course, it's difficult to prove. Nobody, has been able to say conclusively that this money is coming from the party or the United Front, but certainly there is concern that may be the source. Another final example of this kind of influence is in the Chinese language media. So when you have 1.2 million people of Chinese origin, clearly Australia has radio stations that broadcast in Chinese. There are newspapers that are published in Chinese. There's daily and weekly newspapers published in Chinese. And until recently, most of these newspapers were independently owned by Australian Chinese entrepreneurs, who started these businesses. These were small businesses. They'll publish a few thousand copies, distribute them through grocery stores and Chinese restaurants. But they, of course, also rely on advertising revenue. Increasingly, Chinese companies in Australia are big advertisers. And therefore, these publications are also being forced to toe the line and being provided content. In fact, now according to research by some of the Australian scholars, John Fitzgerald particularly, the content, the bulk of the content in these newspapers now comes from official Chinese sources. So Xinhua and other Chinese government and media outlets, provide content for many of these publications. And these publications, rely on advertising revenue, not only from normal Australian companies, but predominantly from Chinese companies who advertise in these papers. And if you don't toe the line, then you will be deprived of advertising revenue from these companies. Also, some of these media outlets, the Chinese language media outlets, are now owned by business groups which are connected to the government in Beijing. So these are no longer, many of these newspapers are no longer small newspapers owned as a small business, but are in fact owned by business interests which have other business interests in China, which are then connected to the party. So again, this has led to a great deal of concern in Australia that this kind of activity is undermining Australian democracy, and therefore something needs to be done. Australia has introduced new foreign interference laws, which are being implemented. Of course, these are not China-centric because they apply to everybody, but they are clearly inspired by the fear that has been triggered by the Chinese activities in Australia. So maybe I'll stop here. I'm happy to take questions.
It's fascinating, and I'm sure there are many more aspects of this debate. And in particular, as an academic, I'm also interested in the academic intrusion of Chinese state into the academic discourse, and how they have some cases have come to light recently in Asia and beyond. But I'll open this up now for your questions, comments, and observations. I think we have half an hour, so we have enough time to bring the audience in. Yes.
Professor Taneja, that was really one of the finest presentations that I've heard in a very long time from an expert. So I have a question for you. How did the West get China so wrong? Why were they fooled by China's seeming subservience so easily? And if I can put it indelicately, how did they allow this monster to develop, and why?
Okay. Yeah, we can take a few questions.
Sir, could you elaborate a little on the India-China cooperation conflict in the Sino-Indian Ocean region?
Can we come back to that later, maybe towards the end? It's a different topic. Yeah, sure.
The chair, while introducing the speaker, started by mentioning the collapse on the consensus on China. So my question to the speaker and maybe the chair later on, is there a new consensus on China forming again in the West, quite opposed to the earlier consensus? Thank you.
We are seeing a US-China kind of trade war, but do you see that there will be an ideological war in terms of, the Western liberal democracy versus the Xi Jinping thought, which is going to be promoting more communism around the world? Especially some few years back, we had a talk, TED Talk, which was really talking about democracy as a failure. And that is also one which is coming for India, particularly in China's discourse, where they say India's democracy is a failure. So probably communism as a model is much better. Could you highlight on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep. It was very enriching indeed. My question relates to the title of your talk, one word, the West. I'm interested in your definition of the West because you first started off talking about the US and then basically focused on Australia. So my question is, first of all, how are the other segments of the West, for example, Western Europe, is looking at China? And secondly, Australia is still sees itself as part of the West, because I thought it was now a nation power. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right. First question about, why were people taken in by China? Why did they actually believe in, the fact that China may change, China may become more democratic or pluralistic? I think partly it was based on the historical experience. Historical experience, as academics, of course, we like to believe in theories. And modernization theory tells us that if you continue to grow economically, if individuals continue to grow economically in a system, then those individuals then want protection of their accumulated wealth. So as China continued to open up its economy, it allowed private enterprise. And remember, China's decision to allow private companies was not easy, and it didn't come, immediately after China began to open up. There was a great deal of soul searching within the Chinese Communist Party. First they were even unwilling to call it private economy, and even now many of the publications actually don't refer to it as private economy. So in the beginning they called them, the household responsibility system, the Kethihu, or the individual household businesses. And it took them a while to actually even come up with the acceptance of the fact that China now had a private economy. Initially, there was even a limit on no more than 8 employees, that a private business was not allowed to hire more than 8 people, because up to 8 people was okay, it was socialist, but if you had more than 8 employees, then it becomes an exploitative. There's a generation of surplus value, and therefore it becomes dangerous. But eventually the party came around to the idea that, okay, this private enterprise was making good, valuable contribution. So there was a belief that as Chinese individuals, Chinese citizens continue to accumulate wealth, they would want to live in a system which will protect that wealth. And these citizens will then demand political change, to demand, for example, independent courts, independent judiciary that will protect their private wealth, rather than be subject to, for example, arbitrary seizure by the state of your accumulated wealth. They were the ones who would become the vanguard of a democratic change. And until 1989, even though the Chinese economy in 1989 was much smaller than it is today, there was a belief that that's exactly the role that the new middle class will play in China's political system. But the party, I think, has been quite creative, quite innovative. And the former party leader Jiang Zemin, his decision to open up the party to the new middle class, the so-called wealthy, was, I think, it was a very smart decision, because there was a conclusion that by leaving these people outside the tent, they become a risk. They become a danger to the party state. So while they're accumulating wealth and they're outside the party state system, they're dangerous. And therefore we need to bring them inside the tent. We co-opt them. And I think people were not thinking, they thought that the party would never allow these people to be members of the party. They would become the adversaries of the party, and they would be a distinct class, and that class would pursue different interests to the interests of the party. But so far, it seems like the corporatist model, as I described, that China has developed, has been very willing and able to accommodate this new middle class. And the new middle class seems to believe that they can remain loyal to the system while being wealthy. And the party state seems to allow that, as long as you don't cross a line. So there's an invisible line. Once you cross the line, you fall out of favor, you end up in New York. But if you stick to the line, if you don't cross that line, then you will continue to be allowed to make money and the country benefits from that, and the party, of course, is not threatened. So I think the innovations that the party has carried out have kind of undermined the validity of many of the arguments which are being made about the nature of the system and how the system might change. I'm not sure if it answers your question, but that is how I explain it to my students.
Can I ask a short follow-up question?
Sure. Yeah.
Professor, do you think the West has similar reasons to favor India?
I don't think anybody fears India. I think India has seen. I mean, one of the goodness of India is that India is a bumbling, democracy, which if it continues to grow at a reasonable speed, it'll be good for the rest of the world. So I don't see the same sort of concern that you see in think tanks and universities and government departments about China. I don't see the same concern. I've just spent a couple of months at a China-focused think tank in Berlin, and certainly the concerns that I witnessed in Australia are also repeated in Europe, and certainly in Germany, where also, according to the Pew survey, which was published just a couple of days ago, in Europe, with the exception of Greece, out of the 32 countries totally surveyed, I think about 8 or 9 of them were in Europe, and in majority of countries, including in Germany, there was a very unfavorable view of China's rising power. Okay, the next question was about, is there a new consensus on China? So if the old consensus that China will evolve into some sort of liberal, pluralistic system, if not an outright democracy, then is there a new consensus on China? Tough question, because it may still be early days, because a consensus would require countries working together to deal with China. And so far, I think that motivation is still lacking. So in Australia, for example, Australian government is aware how much Australia benefits from trade with China. But if you notice, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, when he was sitting with President Trump in the White House, in New York, I think they met in New York, when they were sitting together, President Trump was asked, because he said that China is a threat to the world. And then he looked at Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia and said, Scott's got something tough to say on China too, or something along those lines. And Scott did not say anything bad about China. Scott said, no, we have a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. We do a lot of business with China. China has been good for our economy. So even though the same Prime Minister introduced tough laws to curtail Chinese interference, or his party did, he was then not the Prime Minister at the time, but at the same time, he is unwilling to sit down in a group or in this case, in a press conference with the President of the United States, and expose himself as believing publicly that China was a threat to the world. So I think we are not there yet, because there is still a reluctance to demonstrate that we are openly concerned about China's rise, and not only concerned, that we are willing to do something about it. So even though in terms of private cooperation among diplomats and intelligence agencies and even military security dialogues, those conversations are taking place. But I think there is no consensus that anyone is willing to sign on to. Geeta's question about will there be a new ideological war, or whether there's a the failure of democracy, I would agree with you that I've been observing this for at least last 30 years, how the Chinese media covers Indian democracy, Indian elections, Indian politics. And certainly in the official Chinese media, when you look at the coverage of Indian politics, just the subtext, but the message is that this is a failure. This is what a failure looks like. that Indian democracy is responsible for India's, backwardness, as they describe. And therefore, the message for the Chinese people is that you don't want to be like this, And often the comparisons are drawn with India and China having very similar levels of per capita income when China began the economic reforms in the late 1970s. But look at where we are now and look at where India is now. So certainly, India is often seen as an example of why China should not go down that path. And that, whether India takes that as a challenge or not is a different matter. But the fact is that Indian democracy is often portrayed along those ways. And I think your question is, the second part of your question was probably similar to the last question. So I think I've answered that. Rajiv's question is very good. First of all, let me tackle whether Australia is now part of the Asia-Pacific or the West. Indo-Pacific, yes, exactly. I think in Australia we like to think that we can have our cake and eat it too. So we are Western when it comes to values and talking about sharing those values with the United States, with Europe, and increasingly now with Britain because of Brexit. There's talk of a free trade agreement between Australia and Britain. So, but geographically, of course, there is no denying that Australia is part of the Asia-Pacific region. So when it comes to Australian companies, they are aware most of their businesses with Asian countries, but there is a dichotomy, in fact, and that I think in a way answers Rajiv's question. While the bulk of Australia's trade is with Asia, Australia's largest trading partner is China. Other major partners are Japan and Korea. The United States is not Australia's top trading partner. But when you look at where the bulk of Australia's foreign investment comes from, and where bulk of Australia's foreign investment goes, it's Canada, United States, Britain, largely the Anglosphere. But trade is a different matter because you sell to anybody who wants to buy your commodity. But actually putting your money into another country requires a higher level of confidence in that system. And many Australian entrepreneurs still find it much easier to do business, to run a business in the West, in Europe and in North America, or in New Zealand for that matter, than in Indonesia or Vietnam or China. So trade, of course, is largely focused on Asia because that's where the buyers are and that's where most of the manufactured goods come from. But when it comes to investment, the bulk of Australia's investment does, go to the West. Rajiv, I forgot the first part of your question. Oh yeah, in the West, yeah. I think I partly answered that question when I referred to Germany. This think tank which I was based at certainly has probably the majority of scholars who have a view very similar to the majority of Australian scholars about China. Majority of the international scholars in Australia now have a view of China, that China is a problem. And I saw a similar view in Germany. In fact, some of the German think tanks that work on China hardly have any Chinese scholars working in them. At least in Australia, nearly half the scholars tend to be Chinese in many of our think tanks, think tanks which are focused on China. But I found that there is even concern about hiring Chinese researchers to work on China. So the concern is not limited to Australia and New Zealand. Although the alarm has been first raised in Australia and New Zealand. Australian and New Zealand scholars, Anne-Marie Brady in New Zealand, Clive Hamilton and others in Australia have been leading this debate on growing Chinese interference, but they're very much in demand in Europe. In fact, I met all of them in Europe. Clive Hamilton was sitting next to me in Berlin at a think tank. So clearly, although the alarm may have been raised in Australia and New Zealand, but there is interest in that debate in Europe too.
We have time for one more round. I think
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight sharing. I come from Taiwan, and I work in Sydney before. I met Yihu Jituan Huang Xiangmo.
Okay.
Yeah,
You met
and
him.
I'm very, because in Taiwan we are going to have a presidential election, and our president is a girl. And in Taiwan, whenever you see any news, it's in black. There must be a news in white. When you see exactly, and because of the cyber hack, so serious in my country. Do you have any recommendation, how the outside world, to fight against the China's cyber attack and hack? Thank you.
Professor Taneja, you mentioned about some of the African nations which have students who have studied in China and now they are in the decision-making political positions in the politics. I think the reverse is also true, because what I have read that of all the overseas students in USA, the maximum numbers, they come from China. Yeah. So when these people, say 20 years from hence, they will come up in the decision-making positions, whether in private enterprise or in the government or in the politics. They will also be open to the ideas, or there will definitely be an infusion of the Western liberal ideas in the polity. And that is one reason. And the other reason is that the rise of capitalism and private enterprise, because China is the only, I think, communist country. It'll be a loner. So all these rise of capitalism, private enterprise, and also the internet and communication technology, which is bringing the world together. Do you see, because of all these factors, the breakdown of the Chinese political system in times to come?
Yeah. Dr. Taneja, this is Atul. I am from business. I'm from the industry. China is being spoken a lot in India and everywhere in the world. Here, because for whatever strategies they had for their own nation, they have emerged as a strong nation on practically every field. Mm-hmm. Defense, economy, innovation, everywhere, right? And they have aspirations to continue like that. To continue like that, they have to expand beyond the horizons of that limited land mass. China calls it as their country. Mm-hmm. So if they are doing something for their own progress, and in the process somebody is getting engulfed, should we call it as a Chinese strength or the weakness of those who fear China? That's my strong, opinion. Therefore, my question to you to answer me that.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think we will be just wrapping after this round. So, any final questions?
No, I have one.
Yeah. So then.
My question is that I think the China economy has become strong because of their very low cost of production. Because the state decides on the compensation and what the people will get, etc. So if they come back to Western liberalization, is there a fear that they may no longer remain competitive? Because the cost of production will increase, and labor costs and land costs, etc.
Okay. Thank you. Very different questions, but good to see a couple of questions related to business and labor costs. First of all, on how to stop cyber attacks, I really haven't got a clue, because I am not a technology person, and I'm not sure whether it is possible to create some sort of counter-Great Wall, because China has built the Great Wall, and I'm not sure if we can build a counter-Great Wall. Probably people who are familiar with the technology would know more about it than I would. But certainly there is conversations taking place. People are talking about how to deal with this threat, and there is global. I'm sure diplomats here would know that there is conversation about cybersecurity at very high levels. So unfortunately, Taiwan is not part of that conversation, but certainly conversations are taking place. But I can't tell you exactly technologically whether that's even possible. Now, that's a very good question there on Chinese students in the US and whether they will be the force for promoting liberalism. And that exactly was part of the thinking when Chinese students were being encouraged to go to the US. I mean, Chinese students have been going to the US to study for more than a century. And particularly after the rapprochement, there was this sense that we should encourage, we should offer scholarship to the Chinese students to come and study in the US because they'll take back some good ideas if they go back. And initially, of course, many of these students were not going back. But in the last 15 years or so, we have seen more and more of Chinese students who go to the US actually return to China, particularly those who attain high qualifications like PhDs and things. So many of them return to China, and the experience tells us that liberalism hasn't rubbed off as was expected. And that's partly to do with this newfound nationalism that the Communist Party has been promoting. Now, when these students went to the US, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they went as citizens of a poor developing country which was struggling with not only challenge to the political authority of the party, but also trying to build a strong economy and increase the living standards. Many of these people had tough childhoods, if they went to study in the US 15 or 20 years ago. The current generation of Chinese students who go to the US or Europe or Australia come from fairly well-off backgrounds. And in a way, in Australia, I would consider the watershed to be the 2008 Beijing Olympics. The 2008 Beijing Olympics came as a surprise. I mean, the pre-Olympics came as a surprise to us who teach Chinese students, who talk to the Chinese students quite regularly. In 2008, you might remember the Olympic torch, went through various capitals. In Paris, the Chinese students came out to defend, the so-called sacred torch. I mean, it was interesting that the Communist Party was calling the torch the sacred torch. But in Australia, by the time the Olympic torch came to Canberra, thousands of Chinese students waving the red flag were bussed from Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane to Canberra to defend the torch from a small bunch of Tibetan or Uyghur protesters or any other people who might want to disrupt. And I call that a watershed because that to me was a time when Chinese students kind of began to subscribe to this narrative of a strong China, powerful China, and therefore a proud China and proud Chinese citizens. So these many of these young students actually don't see the party as a communist party. They, even though it is still the Communist Party, still talks about Marxism, but for them, this is the party that has built China into a strong state. And this is the party which has enabled their parents to accumulate the kind of wealth that they've been able to accumulate. So many of these students that we expected to be liberal are in fact quite now nationalistic. And I mean, it doesn't mean that everybody is that way, but there are many Chinese students who in fact, and the interesting thing is that 10 years ago when I was teaching Chinese politics, students from China would be quite happy to cluster after the lecture and talk about, democracy and talk about, what do you think, Professor, about China? What do you think what's going to happen to China? Now, those students are shy in front of other Chinese students. They now come and make an appointment and come and see you in the office because they're too afraid to talk about this as a possibility in China in front of other Chinese students. So what we are seeing really is this new nationalist narrative which the youth in China, including those, who go overseas to study, they are increasingly subscribing to that narrative. And in fact, there have been, as you probably read, there have been cases in classrooms where lecturers have been intimidated by Chinese students because the lecturer has called Taiwan a country or made a statement about the South China Sea, and therefore they have been taken to task by mainland Chinese students. I, for example, when I begin my semester, and nearly a quarter to 40% of the students are from China in my Chinese politics class, I begin my semester by saying that we take a critical view of politics and we engage with critical theories when we study Chinese politics, and therefore there will be things said in this class which you will not like. So if you object to that, you're free to choose another subject. So if you're offended by those criticisms or critical views, you can take another subject. And therefore I preempt any such intimidation by students in my classroom. Sorry? Nobody leaves. Nobody leaves. And now your second part of your question was about the communications technology, internet and mobile phones and all that, whether it will be a threat to the Chinese system. I still remember when Rupert Murdoch bought the Star TV. The Li Ka-shing and his son had set up the Star TV network in Hong Kong. Rupert Murdoch paid roughly, I think, $700 million to acquire Star TV. And he, soon after taking over the Star TV network, he gave a speech in the British Parliament, in fact, in one of the halls in the British Parliament, where he very confidently declared that satellite television and similar technologies would be threat to totalitarian regimes around the world. Within 6 months, Rupert Murdoch, his publishing company, had given a $1 million advance to Deng Xiaoping's daughter to write a hagiography about her father. And Rupert Murdoch's company had switched off the transponder on the satellite, which beamed BBC News to China. And I know because I was living in China, I spent $2,000 buying a satellite dish to get BBC. And suddenly we had no access to BBC because Rupert prioritized his business interest in China over freedom. So I have become, since then I've become quite skeptical of the potential of these technologies to change political systems. And then we've seen the Chinese government, through its very active policy framework, has been able to promote Chinese companies. So Tencent and Baidu and others are as big and in some cases bigger than American companies who operate in this area. So the Great Firewall of China seems to be working, and at the same time the firewall doesn't prevent Chinese ambassadors and Chinese officials and the editor of the Global Times from trolling people on Twitter and Facebook. So the Great Firewall of China works in a very convenient fashion. It prevents ordinary citizens from accessing information, but it allows people that the party state wants to be able to access those platforms outside China to do so. So I think particularly having looked at how these technologies have been used by the Chinese state in the last couple of decades, I am a bit skeptical whether this can actually be the trigger to political change in China. Your business argument, this is what I hear from, in fact, many business people. So you are in good company, that a lot of people believe that what China has been able to achieve is good for China, it's good for the world. If Chinese people, if 1.3 billion people in China have benefited from those economic policies, then certainly it can't be bad for others. And certainly I think, I live in Australia, I know my university would not pay me the salaries they pay because without Chinese students, the bulk of the international students come from China. So they do help me earn a decent living. And so do, I think, many of the employees of mining companies in Australia and other people. But I do think that economic success cannot be equated with the rights of citizens, and therefore there are many people in China, despite the rising tide of nationalism among Chinese students overseas, there are many people in China who would like to see a very different, very different framework where they can actually exercise their freedoms. So when you talk to people privately in China, you do hear that they would prefer, if there was a choice, to have greater freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. A lot of people, and in fact, they read about it. Many of the educated Chinese people read about other countries. I've seen business people who read books on politics, and not books published in China. They're reading books on politics from America and from other countries. So clearly, successful business people in China also have not given up on the cause for freedom, I think. Now, whether they are willing to take on the party state and risk everything, that's an open question. But it doesn't mean that just because they are now willing to be co-opted, that they will remain co-opted, forever. So, but I agree with you that China's economic growth has been good for the world. So the dispute is not over China's economic growth. I think China has lifted many countries economically with its own, by lifting Chinese people, 1.3 billion people.
They are one of the shining examples. I would not be a pharmacy of the world unless China gives me APIs.
Sure, I mean, if you have access to the Chinese market, then you'll do well. But not everybody gets access to the Chinese market. We know that too. Okay, on the labor cost, already I think we are seeing that labor costs and other costs, including energy costs in China, are pushing Chinese enterprises and other foreign companies operating in China to leave China. It's not only President Trump's rhetoric and tariffs which are forcing companies to leave. Rising costs in China are also forcing companies, both Chinese and foreign, to leave China for other shores. Particularly if you have no other technology, if you rely on labor cost manufacturing, then China is not the right place for you to be. And increasingly Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and even Bangladesh are benefiting. I'm not sure how many companies have come to India, but certainly I have, just anecdotal evidence shows you that Chinese entrepreneurs and foreign companies are in fact moving their labor-intensive production. And this is why the Made in China campaign of President Xi Jinping is focused not on labor-intensive manufacturing. It's focused on two key technologies, artificial intelligence and robotics, because the Chinese Communist Party wants the Chinese enterprises to move up the value chain. So move up the value chain, because China would not be, a high-income country. China will not be able to avoid the low-income, the middle-income trap if China sticks to, labor-intensive manufacturing, and therefore acquiring access to those technology. And China has done very well. China has invested heavily in both robotics and artificial intelligence. I mean, they are facing a bit of a roadblock now, because the continued development of these two technologies in China does require access to American and other technologies. And the sanctions which have been put in place by the Trump administration are making it harder. But that certainly is the goal, to move up the value chain so that Chinese companies can remain competitive and they employ people who are paid higher wages. Because otherwise, China gets stuck in the middle income trap, which is one of the biggest fears, in fact, of the Chinese government at the moment. Now, finally, I want to come to the Indian Ocean, the Chinese, just very briefly. I think there is no doubt that Chinese footprint in the Indian Ocean is growing. We are witnessing a growing interest by China in the Indian Ocean. Now, what China's motives are, they still, when you talk to the Chinese people, they say, no, this is all about, China uses, much of China's trade goes through the Indian Ocean, and therefore China is interested in in protecting the sea lanes of communications. You know, it's been said that the United States Navy has protected the sea lanes of communications since the Second World War. And the argument goes that China now wants to be able to do it for itself. That China doesn't want to outsource it to the US. China wants to be able to protect the sea lanes of communication. But I think that is only part of the argument. The other part of the argument is that China does want to be a key strategic player in the Indian Ocean. And for that, the ability to project power far from the Chinese shores is very much part of the same agenda. So, you know, what I'm looking at, in fact, is at the moment my project looks at the Sino-Indian competition in the Indian Ocean, and particularly the response of the small island states. You know, so how the small island states kind of play off one against the other, you know, to try and maximize, you know, their own interests. So, but as part of that, of course, we are looking very closely at both Chinese and Indian, you know, activities in the Indian Ocean region. And from China's point of view, China says that we are no threat to anyone. We don't mean to cause any harm to India or anybody else. This is just about, you know, playing our role. And in fact, there's another interesting argument that is made, is that as a country with the world's second largest economy, we want to do our bit for enhancing the security of the global commons. You know, so that it's been expected of us as a large power, as a permanent member of the Security Council, we want to do our bit, you know, to contribute to protecting the sea lanes of communication. But certainly, I see it as part of China's overall power projection. And remember that there is this very strong sense in China that China needs to be respected. I don't know if some of you saw the tweet by the editor of the Global Times newspaper, you know, pointing to the presence of one of the hypersonic ballistic missiles in the parade, DF-41, and he said that this is Chinese, and he said, I have touched it once in the plant where it was made, but don't fear it, just respect it, and respect the country that owns them, and you'll be fine. You know, so there is also this sense that China's growing military power, including China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean, is about earning respect from the international community. And, you know, as long as that respect is there, in some ways it is a little bit of a reminder of the tributary state system, that as long as you respect the Chinese emperor, you pay your tributes, you'll be left alone, you'll be fine. But if you challenge that, then you get into trouble.
So, what do you think?
We continue this conversation. I mean, we are just.
I'll be happy to talk to you later.
We are just over time, and I think we can continue this conversation afterwards as well. I mean, this is a topic on which there's so much to be said, and I'm sure we are waiting for your book to come out soon on the Indian Ocean. But thank you, Pradeep, for coming, and keep coming.
Thank
and
you.
It was wonderful to have you here, and it was wonderful. I think outline of the kind of trends we are going to witness in the larger trajectory of international relations. And this is a topic that will continue to dominate our conversations here at the Public Policy Think Tank, as well as outside, whether it's business, whether it's academia, or whether it's any other platform. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.